I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. I mentioned earlier that Steve Sheffey is going to play a major role in this conversation, and I'm so delighted that he is available to do that for us. Steve, if you don't know, is a consultant based in Chicago. He has a number of clients, and one of his clients is actually the Jewish Democratic Council of America. So when he said he's never met Halie, I suspect that is not the case. They, of course, are colleagues and good friends, and I'm very excited for the conversation that they're going to bring us all into. Steve also publishes a weekly progressive newsletter, which I read as it arrives in my inbox every Sunday. You know, you get a lot of stuff and only some of it is must read, but there's not a week that's gone by that I haven't learned something really interesting from Steve, usually his insightful commentary on events of that week. So I strongly recommend you all find a way of subscribing to his newsletter. Steve also serves on Heart of a Nation's advisory committee. Halie Soifer, I think you know, is also involved with Heart of a Nation. So it's very much a conversation within the family, which we've opened up to pretty much the known universe. Steve, why don't you get our conversation going by introducing Halie and laying out a couple of questions you have for her.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for that very warm introduction. It really is, Halie is a good friend. You're right, I was kidding about that. She is the CEO of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, which is the national voice of Jewish Democrats. She has previously served in a number of high-ranking positions, including National Security Advisor to then Senator Kamala Harris. She's also held major positions for Senator Chris Coons, for Ted Kaufman, and for Congressman Robert Wexler. And she's also worked in the Obama administration. So she's done a tremendous amount of work and is a respected national security and policy advisor. And under her leadership, Jewish Democratic Council of America has grown to become, in just not too much more than 3 years, the voice of Jewish Democrats across the country. And she's quoted in all sorts of publications. In fact, as recently as literally this morning in Haaretz on the controversy regarding Iron Dome. So she's a tremendous resource, and I'm really glad that she's involved in Heart of a Nation because her expertise is unique. And I think she'll really make it a much better organization. And we thought we'd ask a few questions of Halie because about the issue of about the peace process and what the politicization is. And I guess the first question I'd ask of Halie is, in what ways have the issues of Israel and peace with the Palestinians been politicized in recent years?
Thanks, Steve. I'll just start. I will answer the question, but I'll start by thanking everyone for joining and thank Jonathan for convening us, not just today in this moment, but convening us through Heart of a Nation. It's an honor to serve as a part of this organization, and it really has broadened the dialogue. It's a rare opportunity to come together as Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians in such a open and constructive space. And I really appreciate this organization for doing that and look forward to seeing it grow. As someone who has been a part of an organization, as Steve said, that has grown a lot in the past 3 years, those first few years are it's so instrumental to the future of the organization. I look forward to seeing what Heart of a Nation will do. And I'm happy to be a part of it. So JDCA, the organization which I lead, is explicitly partisan. We are a democratic organization. We advocate for Jewish and democratic values, and we support candidates who align with those values. And while all the candidates we support happen to be Democrats, we don't necessarily support all Democrats, and I'm happy to talk about that. But when it comes to Israel, this is the one issue where we actually have tried to depoliticize the political climate. We have seen the issue of Israel has been politicized in recent years. It's been politicized and used as a political wedge issue for decades. And never have we seen it politicized as much as it has been, in my view, during the Trump administration. And again, while I represent a partisan organization, we would like to see there to be a continuation of bipartisan support for Israel. We don't want to see this issue politicized. And, just to give some examples of what I mean by this, let's start with the issue of a two-state solution. Going back to the 90s, even before the Clinton administration, starting with the first Bush administration, and every administration subsequently, so both Bush administrations, the Clinton administration, then of course the Obama administration, you had bipartisan support for a two-state solution. It really was not seen as a political issue. It was seen as objectively a goal of US foreign policy was to bring the two sides together. And in 2016, that changed. And it wasn't just with Trump's election, it actually predates that. It was with the adoption by the Republican Party of a policy platform, which is something both parties do every 4 years, that intentionally omitted a reference to a two-state solution. And on the other side, you had Democrats, which every 4 years also adopts a policy platform. Usually these things are about 100 pages, and always there's a section on Israel. It does tend to be a contentious section, but as it had in past years, the Democratic Party platform included a support for a two-state solution, and as a change, a departure, the Republican platform did not. And that really set the tone for the Trump administration and the subsequent 4 years. There was no effort to champion a two-state solution. There was really, I would call it kind of an abandonment. And it didn't just remain with the administration. It was also embraced by Republicans in Congress. The issue of support of a two-state solution was really orphaned by the Republicans and embraced by the Democrats. And although it became harder to envision how the two sides might come together in those 4 years, there's no question that this played a role, because all of a sudden it was seen as a partisan issue in the United States. And you did not hear or see the Trump administration make any efforts to bring the two sides together. To the contrary, there was an ending of relations with the Palestinian Authority. There were many steps that were taken by the administration in 2018, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the moving of the embassy, and the severing of ties with Palestinians, the cutting of aid to Palestinians that were highly politicized at the time. They stopped funding UNRWA in August of 2018. And there was, while some might agree with these policy goals, we, JDCA, recognize Jerusalem, for example, as the capital of Israel. The way the administration went about doing it was highly politicized. For example, when they moved the embassy, there were no Democrats that were there. Normally, these events would be championed by a bipartisan delegation. It was viewed as a Republican delegation. So too, fast forward 4 years when the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gave a speech at the Republican convention using Jerusalem as a backdrop. This was unprecedented, that Jerusalem, or in any way foreign policy or the Secretary of State, would be used as a part of a political convention. So the issue of Israel became highly politicized from the administration, and then it definitely trickled down to Congress. There are many examples where Republicans would manipulate, and they continue to manipulate, votes to turn Israel into a political issue, to give the impression in many cases, to misconstrue the facts that Democrats are in some way abandoning Israel or voting against Israel, when in reality, they are just manipulating procedural measures in Congress for that political purpose. And most recently, it's been very interesting. This is, Jonathan started by saying this is very timely. We've seen this play out even with the Iron Dome funding, which has become very politically charged. As we know, this was an issue where on both sides, there was questions, there was opposition. The Democrats in the House very much wanted to make good on President Biden's pledge in May to replenish the Iron Dome interceptors, which were obviously, the stockpile was depleted after the conflict with Hamas. And despite an effort to put it in the continuing resolution, which is very partisan, no Republicans were going to vote for that in the House. They pushed forward to move it into a standalone bipartisan measure that passed overwhelmingly in the House and is now stalled in the Senate by one senator. Senator Paul is now holding it in the Senate. And it's been very interesting to watch the dynamic play out in terms of the difference. Some call it a double standard, some call it selective outrage, that you hear in terms of the anger that is directed at Paul for hijacking and at this point, stalling this funding in perpetuity. We don't know how this is going to end. I would say that his measure of blocking this funding has been far more consequential than any one House member has ever done. But if you compare and contrast that with the language and rhetoric that was directed at some House members a few weeks ago now, 2 weeks ago, for their opposition, which in the end was not consequential because the bill still passed, it's been interesting to see that play out. The bottom line is that U.S. policy toward Israel shouldn't be politicized. I think it's dangerous, and it does erode the historic bipartisan support for Israel that has existed for decades. And it's not just U.S. officials who have done this. We also saw it play out between Donald Trump and Netanyahu, and we saw them both try to use U.S. policy toward Israel to their own political advantage in numerous elections in recent years. It didn't work out for Donald Trump, which is perhaps why he said in August of 2020 that he moved the embassy for the evangelicals. In the end, he kind of gave up on us Jews who he deemed disloyal. But there's no question that in the 3 elections where it was Trump and Netanyahu, and we've all seen the images of Donald Trump and Netanyahu that Netanyahu used in his elections, but also there were policy concessions that accompanied each of those elections, such as recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. So whether you agree with those decisions or not, is something to be considered. But another thing to be considered is the use of those policy decisions for political purposes, and it's dangerous.
And I would add also, before going to the next question, Halie, that between the time that Hoyer announced that the $1 billion would be in the continuing resolution and the time the House passed $1 billion standalone aid for the Iron Dome, a grand total of 2 days elapsed. And what Senator Paul is doing, it's going on indefinitely. It's much, much worse there. But what you described in terms of partisanship is really something that's true of almost every issue in Washington, from healthcare to budget to infrastructure. Why is it dangerous, in particular, to politicize support for the peace process? What should we be concerned about? Why is what you've described is accurate, but could you help us understand why it's harmful?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that it's set back prospects for peace. It's been destabilizing. But it also suggests that U.S. foreign policy is erratic and driven solely by whomever is in the White House, which frankly was never the case, or whichever party has control. I was a civil servant in the Bush administration. I worked at the State Department during the Annapolis conference, which, this was, I believe, 2007. And despite the fact that, I was proud to work in a Republican administration, frankly, that was bringing the two sides together. And the foreign policy at the time was not politically charged. And you contrast that with the next Republican administration, the Trump administration, and, the intent matters. And the two sides know that. The two sides see through it. And obviously for the Netanyahu government, the relationship with Trump and the use of US policy toward Israel for political purposes seemed to work well. So they were happy with that status quo or new status quo. But for the Palestinians, there was absolutely no dialogue, no trust. And we've seen the impact of that. They're still repairing much of that damage that was done in those 4 years in terms of the Biden administration. We also see it in Congress. And this predates the Trump administration, but a lot of people point to Netanyahu's joint address in 2015 as if he just appeared in Congress to talk about Iran. But the reality is it was the Republicans in Congress who invited him without informing the Obama White House. If we point to that, and again, this predates Trump, that was quite dangerous as well, because there were many Democrats who, as you may recall, boycotted that speech. They felt it was a slap in the face of President Obama. And it was the Republicans and John Boehner at the time, the speaker, who made that decision to have this highly politicized joint address where you had a foreign official, an Israeli prime minister, coming to Congress at the invitation of the leadership to disparage what was the leading foreign policy goal of the president, the US president. So it was damaging. We saw how divisive the JCPOA, that debate was in the following months for not just in Congress, but in the Jewish community. We felt it deeply. And we're still repairing some of that damage.
Those were kind of, you painted a rather depressing picture. And I'm wondering, Halie, is bipartisanship on Middle East issues even still possible? Are there recent examples of the two parties, for example, working together to advance the security of Israel, Palestinian humanitarian assistance, and support for Israeli-Palestinian coexistence?
It is still possible. I mean, I think I'd like to think that what I've described are some of the most egregious examples are still more the exception than the rule. In the same way that I'd like to think, I don't know if this is actually the case. We'll see in the next election that the Trump administration was an anomaly for us. If, as a US democracy, as in terms of our values, as I said, that is the goal of JDCA, is to advocate for our values. I'd like to think that 4 years was an anomaly. But if we look even at recent votes, there's no question that support of Israel does remain bipartisan. That Iron Dome vote in the House, 420 members, Republicans and Democrats, voted for it. And even now that it's in the Senate, 99 members of Congress, of course, all Democrats and all but one Republican, are supportive of that funding for Israel. But there's no question that damage has been done when it comes to support of two states. That truly is now seen through a political lens, and you won't see any Republicans that will rhetorically express support for it. We had a Republican senator hold U.S. aid to the Palestinians for the past, I think, 7 months. Risch from, gosh, where's he from? Idaho. We had Jim Risch hold that assistance. The Biden administration tried to restart it, and he held it with very few consequences from his own party. That is still happening. But on the whole, you also have good projects like the Middle East Partnership Initiative that was started by Nita Lowey, and it passed on a bipartisan basis last year, and now USAID will be implementing it to really champion projects between Israelis and Palestinians. Another great example of bipartisanship when it comes to Israel. And I would also say, to the extent that we're going to move away now from the anomaly that was the past 4 years of a highly politicized US policy toward Israel, Biden is the exact opposite. He refuses to use Israel for political purposes. There was a lot of pressure on him, for example, around the conflict with Hamas in May, and he really truly did, I think, what he believed was in the U.S. national security interests and Israel's interests, in terms of the timing, the language, the pressure that he exerted on both sides. That was not what was happening in those 11 days in terms of the White House was not a political calculation. That was truly a national security calculation and a calculation in terms of our partnerships and security and stability in the region. And so everything that we've seen that indicates that this administration is not going to use it. But to the extent that you have a White House that chooses to use Israel for political purposes, there's no question that it will trickle down to Congress, and frankly, even the way the American people view it as well.
We've talked, and that's all true, and we've spent a lot of time talking about our Republican friends and some of their disagreements, but a lot of people remember, and we're here with Heart of a Nation, and we're nonpartisan, of course, and there have been a lot of questions asked, both within the Democratic Party and generally, about what is the state of the Democratic Party in general, and the Progressive Caucus in particular, regarding the dynamics of the Middle East. There are some prominent members of the Progressive Caucus who seem to have a different point of view on some matters concerning Israel from the rest of the Democratic Party. And we've heard a lot. We've talked about Rand Paul, but what about within the Democratic Caucus and the Progressive Caucus specifically? Can you describe for us, what are the dynamics? What's really going on there?
Sure. I mean, I think this is something that's discussed ad nauseum, and frankly, I think the role and the influence of a few is often exaggerated. And we saw this, and this Iron Dome vote or stalling now is a good example of this playing out. When you compare the impact of those 9 members of Congress who voted against Iron Dome, 8 Democrats and 1 Republican, they didn't really have an impact, right? It passed overwhelmingly and immediately went to the Senate. The reality is that the Democratic Party, the reason that was the case is that the Democratic Party, the leadership, and the overwhelming majority of the caucus was there to ensure that that was passed. Even some Democrats, Jamal Bowman's a good example from New York, who opposed attaching the aid to the continuing resolution, ended up voting for it because on principle, they knew that Israel needed this and that it was a national security priority that we were going to send this aid. So, I would say there's overwhelming support of the U.S.-Israel relationship within the Democratic Party as a whole, and that's reflected in our party platform that was adopted in 2020. That's reflected in the support of Israel within the Biden administration. But importantly, you also have the overwhelming majority of Democrats who don't see their support of Israel and their support of Palestinian rights and security and safety as a binary choice. And you heard an articulation of that more, I think, than ever before in May, as there was not just the raining down of rockets targeting Israelis, but also a loss of life on the Palestinian side. You did hear Democrats who had not necessarily articulated this view do so, such as Senator Menendez, Senator Coons, Representative Meeks. And that was an important articulation of truly where Democrats are, which is we support two states. And we know two states will never come about if there's not a recognition of both Israel's security and right to self-defense, but also Palestinian rights, Palestinian safety. So I would say that's been a positive development in the past 6 months as it relates to Democrats. Now, when it comes to progressives, I would caution anyone from generalizing on a view of Israel among progressives in the Democratic Party. I think you have distinct members with distinct views as it relates to this conflict. I think Rashida Tlaib, for example, is in kind of a category of her own. She is a Palestinian American. She's very proud of that. She talks frequently about her family. And she, I would call this identity politics for her. You have others who, and she's the only member of Congress who has questioned two states and has actually articulated support for a one-state solution. You have others who have joined her in calling for restrictions, conditionings, or cutting of aid. You have one other, Ilhan Omar, who's joined her in expressing support for BDS. But I'm reticent to say there is a uniform view among progressives
And Halie, I
with
would also
regard to
add,
Israel.
I think it's also interesting that Ilhan Omar supports BDS and very clearly supports a two-state solution and voted for $3.3 billion of security assistance to Israel. So they really are very different.
They are. And then,
Anyway,
Jamal Bowman, I mentioned him because I think he considers himself a part of the squad. They've invited him to be a part of the squad. So let's just call him a part of, their self-named squad. But he voted for the Iron Dome funding. So they're not homogenous. And I would, caution against these generalizations that we see in terms of them, being of exactly on the same page when it comes to Israel. And I would also caution against the rhetoric that we use. There's a lot of words that have been thrown around when we generalize about folks with regard to their views on Israel. And I think we need to look at each individually.
I would add also that there are 95 members of the Progressive Caucus, not 5 or 6. And the overwhelming majority, of course, do support aid, and including Iron Dome. That's something else that people might want to keep in mind when they talk about this. We should not generalize. As we move to the last question, we've talked a lot about Israel, but just for the members of Heart of a Nation on the call, what are some of the other issues that JDCA is focusing on today?
So we focus on the priorities of Jewish voters, and we frequently will look at polling to see what are the most important issues driving the Jewish vote. And it might surprise people, but the number one issue as of July was climate change. The number 2 issue was threats to our democracy, which include voter suppression laws being imposed or at least proposed by Republicans in nearly every state. Interestingly, there's bipartisan concern among Jewish voters on that issue. We found that 50% of Jewish Republicans are concerned about threats to our democracy. So this is a very important issue for JDCA. Gun safety is critical. And as we're speaking, I see there's another shooting in Texas. And for those who aren't here in the United States, in a way, you're lucky you don't see these shootings every day, but nearly every day we have a shooting in the United States that could be avoided. But the list goes from there to economic issues, to COVID, and almost every domestic policy issue, including extremism and anti-Semitism, will be prioritized above Israel, interestingly. Now, that's not to say that Jewish voters don't care about Israel. They certainly do. and JDCA certainly does. But what we see when it plays out in elections, which we're looking at closely, is that it's a threshold issue, that the overwhelming majority of candidates, Democrats and Republicans, will meet that threshold of support of Israel to the point where the voters will vote on those issues where candidates are most distinct. Those tend to be domestic policy issues. And Israel is really not an issue that Jews are voting on. However, there are exceptions, such as we recently had a primary in Ohio where both candidates didn't meet at least that perceived threshold of support of Israel. And it did become an election issue. So there are exceptions to that rule, but I would say it's those domestic policy issues, as well as ensuring that support of Israel remains bipartisan, are the priorities of JDCA.
Halie, thank you so much. And Steve, you're doing a magnificent job. With your permission, I'd like to invite others who are on the call to pose questions. I saw that Dana Gordon posted a question for us. I don't know if she's still on. If she is, I'd encourage her to, Dana, if you don't mind, maybe pose your question out loud. It's a good one. And then others, please raise your hand or send a message and let me know that you've got a question.
Okay, my question today is about J Street. So J Street is a pro-Israel PAC that has a lot of Democratic support. They recently held a fundraiser for Marie Newman, who was one of the people that voted against the Iron Dome. What do we do with that? They say they support Iron Dome funding and they are pro-Israel, but yet they're promoting a very anti-Israel fundraiser.
Well, thanks, Dana. So
Sure.
I think what I would do is with the question is just distinguish JDCA from J Street or AIPAC, just so people understand the difference. I mean, because we're frequently conflated with these organizations, because obviously we are a Jewish organization. Those organizations are predominantly made up of members of the Jewish community. But the distinction would be that those are ostensibly nonpartisan, Israel-focused organizations. They might be slightly on, along that spectrum of being pro-Israel in terms of how they would define it and the policies that they advocate for, but they are Israel organizations. As described, JDCA is not solely an Israel organization, and we are explicitly partisan. We did advocate for members to support that Iron Dome funding, both behind closed doors and very publicly. And it was disappointing to see the 8 Democrats who voted against, including Marie Newman. And JDCA is not going to be having a fundraiser for her. Let's put it that way.
Thanks.
Very good. A good question and a good answer. Can I see a hand or an indication of who else might want to pose a question? The alternative, of course, is that I'm going to call on Ari Roth. I'm going to call on Wayne Firestone. I'm going to call on Marla Pierce.
I'll just also, in fairness to J Street, for that, I'm sure that event was planned well before the vote. So they had to probably make a tough call about whether or not they were going to cancel it, which also would have sent, a message that clearly they didn't want to send. But, I'm sure it was scheduled well before. So I can't speak to their decision-making beyond that.
One of the most important points that Halie has stressed is that we really make a mistake when we look at a complicated political universe in terms of monolithic opinions. Jews are not monolithic, Democrats are not monolithic, pro-Israel organizations are not monolithic. If they were, you wouldn't need quite so many of them. And I'm hoping that people appreciate that what Halie has said is that her organization has a very unique role. J Street has a different role, AIPAC a third role. And for those of us who are most involved, we can pick a team. We can also appreciate the commitment that the activists associated with each of those communities bring to their issues.
Yeah, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive.
And they're not mutually exclusive.
We've been proud to partner with all those organizations, as well as Heart of a Nation, frankly.
Halie mentioned the legacy legislation of former Congresswoman Nita Lowey, and I delight when I reflect on the fact that J Street and AIPAC and Haley's organization and certainly Heart of a Nation were all on the same side. And while that doesn't happen every day, I do recognize that it does happen from time to time, reminding us of the common ground that we stand on. I think we've got another question. Adam, help me out. Is there?
Looks like Todd had a question.
Yeah, oh, good. Todd?
Well, he posted it. Do you want me to read it? It looks like he's muted.
Yes. If,
Yeah, I mean, it was just
Todd,
more
if
of a-
you're there?
Yeah, it just was more of a comment, so I don't have anything else to add to it.
Sure.
And then I think this whole tendency to sort of say, okay, I disagree with someone on one thing, therefore I'm done with that person, I can't support them, is really a structural weakness in the Democratic Party right now. And it's one of the main reasons why the Democratic Party can't get together on really important issues like infrastructure. So I just, you know, when you say, okay, well, someone voted this way on one thing, now we're not going to support them, now we're not going to have a fundraiser. I'm not sure that's certainly not the way I approach my political views, and obviously everyone's free to look at it the way they want, but I think it's dangerous. I mean, to just sort of, you know, as Americans, to sort of say, well, Israel's a litmus test, or even more so, this particular vote is a litmus test for whether or not we're going to be, you know, supporting a candidate. I mean, I don't know. I know one thing. I don't want the Republican who's going to run against me to win it, personally. So, you know,
I would add to what Todd said. You know, it's kind of like if you watch a football game, and if your team wins 35-3, are you going to be happy, or are you going to obsess about why the other team kicked a field goal and somehow scored 3 points? 96% of Democrats in the House voted for Iron Dome. 90% of the Progressive Caucus voted for Iron Dome, and yet for some reason, some people fixate on a handful of Democrats, all of whom, by the way, had different reasons. If you read their statements, some were concerned about the process, some were concerned about the amount of money, some may be concerned about the economics of it. We do have to be very careful not to draw conclusions or pigeonhole people, and that's on, by the way, both sides of the aisle. It doesn't really help us to do that. If we're concerned seriously about policy, we should look at what, number one, at what the members do and what their reasons are, and there are different reasons for doing certain things. And I think number two, we have to be careful to also look at the big picture as well, which is that there was overwhelmingly support for Iron Dome. Just as Halie pointed out, in the Senate, there's overwhelming support for Iron Dome. There's one senator who is blocking it. He happens to be a Republican, but the good news is that it is overwhelmingly supported in both houses of Congress. And there are major differences between the parties, major differences on almost every issue you can think of, but not so much on Israel. I mean, 2 states is a problem. And as Halie pointed out, that could be because one party has politicized it under the leadership of its recent president, but hopefully it won't stay like that forever. And I think what Heart of a Nation wants to try to do is bring everyone who wants peace together. And I would include Republicans who are willing to join us in that endeavor.
So I have to jump to another call, but I want to give my side of the story. So I'm Israeli. I'm American now. I'm here for almost 10 years. I think that what you said, Steve, is the right thing to look at it, because you have to look at the big picture. And when you look at the Iron Dome, it's much more, you're saving life by Iron Dome. So you're looking at the national security of a country, a national security of a state. And I think that to look at and we all, I'm working for Republican, and he's for 2-state solution, 100% per excellence, and so is I. And we're working on that, as Jonathan know. And we didn't have a lot of, we have a hard time about it. So what I want to say is the most important thing is not to politicize, as Halie said, things, because when you are politicized stuff and when you do it and when you look at what's going on in Israel the past 10 years, I think that the Israelis are not the way that the political in Israel is shows in the world. So when we make those decisions here in the United States vis-a-vis Israel, and especially the Democrat Party, it's an excuse. And we have to be very, very careful about it, because in the end of the day, I'm going to the big picture. It's something that, I'm sorry about my English, I'm Israeli. I think that it's hurt the strength between the two countries, and the strength and the security of this country. So I would think that to make those decisions, you have to definitely not politicize it, and from both party, and not to take decision in the Senate by thinking of, and I don't know how to explain that in the right way, but it's really dangerous to see what's going on by the because there are so many things that doing behind the scene between the Palestinian and the Israelis, that they're working on different channels and trying to go to the goal, the real goal for this two state. And a lot of Israelis, I think that the political results are not the right results. I think that 70% of the people in Israel would like to give more respect for the affordable or even more than 70% to the Arabs and to the Palestinian in Israel. So that's something that the world should know. And especially, and I'm happy that I'm dropped to this call, maybe just to make sure that my conversation with Jonathan will be with you guys.
Michal, thank you. And, you know, as you've told me so many times one-on-one, you know, first, we do no harm. And in politics, we've seen a lot of harm done. And for the people whose lives are on the line, it's painful, it's tragic. But Michal, you and the people—
If you have an idea, how can we go to that road for two state? We're welcome, really. We're working on that even right now.
For sure, yes.
I mean, in those moments right here in this office, and Ronald is traveling. I mean, we are trying to look for the answer. We're trying to work on that from both sides. I know I had a lot of conversation with this government. I mean, we're trying, they're trying. I'm here now, but I mean, they're trying to do everything. They're not going to take any decision because of they don't want to break the government, but whatever they could give to the Palestinian, all kinds of rights, human rights. I mean, they will do that. That they don't need a government decision. And
Michal, let me pose a question to Halie. Prime Minister Bennett has been to the United States twice already. Yair Lapid will be in Washington next week. What is the sense among the Democratic members of Congress that you interact with? What is their sense of the new government, an unusual government in so many ways? and the new government's commitment to strengthening the U.S.-Israel relationship and specifically reaching out to a greater extent to the Democratic Party and to the American Jewish community?
I think there's great optimism and hope and just a sense of a reset, no matter who was to come in, so long as it wasn't the same government, essentially, that's been there for 12 years. I think there was great hope, and there continues to be. You saw one Democratic-led House delegation and one Democratic-led Senate delegation go to Israel. There hasn't been a lot of those typical kind of visits to the Hill lately because we have, Delta and whatever else. But the meetings that have occurred have been, warmly welcomed and applauded. I think the visits to Israel were probably even more consequential. And you have U.S. lawmakers in Israel, like Senator Murphy, who are talking about the importance of U.S. dialogue with the Palestinians as well, which is very important to finally, not only try to re-engage and repair some of that damage, but to actually have leaders in the Senate who are championing that. And it's good to see. And they do so knowing that there's at least tacit support within the new Israeli government for this policy change from the last administration to this administration. So I think there's hope and optimism, and so far it's gone very well to have this new government in place. There were questions about where Bennett would stand, and I think so far, I think most people are just warmly welcoming this new government.
I'm looking for others who may want to participate in this conversation. Julie from Israel.
Wayne's got a question.
Yes, Brian.
Wayne's got a question. Wayne Firestone.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Wayne?
Halie, I wanted to get your reaction. I want to go back to the Iron Dome discussion for a minute and get your reaction to Sarah Silverman's posting, in part because, first of all, was there any reaction or acknowledgement of that sort of more nuanced pushback or direct pushback from someone in the progressive camp? And just generally, we tend to watch op-eds in the Washington Post and the New York Times and things like that. And I'm sort of curious to what kind of discussion around this you picked up on in more in the social media.
Yeah, I think it was important what she said. Not just what she said, but the fact that it was her saying it in the way she said it. She basically said, I love you and want to keep loving you. So coming from the truly the left of our party, kind of that Bernie Sanders camp. And she's made no secret of that. But she makes a good point that, when you talk about your position with regard to the conflict, you don't talk about Hamas's role and the fact that, she really personalized it. She talked about her family in Israel and how Iron Dome has saved lives. And it does kind of get at what I think it was Michal that just mentioned this, that it saved lives really on both sides of the border because it's mitigating escalations of conflict, so long as, it's obviously in the near term, it's saving Israeli lives. But after that, if in fact there's not a loss of life, you don't have the further retaliation, the cycle of violence. So I think she made a lot of really good points. And the most important aspect of it was really who it was, because people on the left look to her in our community. She really has an important platform, and she made it very personal too. I thought it was a very compelling and important message. And yes, it's, she puts her podcast on Instagram. She's doing all the Gen Z kind of social media things that we all aspire to do, right? She's podcasting and showing video at the same time. And I'm sure her voice was heard by many. I thought it was really important.
Halie, if I can just amplify what you just said, I'm so struck by the fact that she specifically said, I love you and I want to understand
Right.
you, and I'd like you to understand me, as opposed to those who say, I hate you and I want to take issue with what you have to say. I mean, it begs the question, which has the better chance of initiating a productive dialogue? People sometimes forget that when you express your hatred for an individual and everything they stand for, and then want to engage them in conversation, it's a difficult uphill climb. But to say, wait a minute, we see eye to eye on a lot of things, on this we don't, can we have a conversation? Whether it's done privately and directly or publicly, I feel so much better. And obviously the credo of Heart of a Nation is to better not batter the nations we love, and to better not batter our interlocutors, and to recognize, as so many on this call have said, that we're going to agree and we're going to disagree, and then we're going to agree and we're going to disagree. And we've got to decide what actually produces a better outcome. The approach that we've just seen and heard and admire, or the toxic partisanship, which gets in the way of a lot of great people even communicating with one another. I'm just going on and on, looking for another question. Brian, do you see somebody?
Ari has a question. Ari?
Oh, good. Ari?
I'm
Ari, you're on mute.
happy to be on this call, and I've been impressed with everything that Heart of a Nation has been putting out since I got on the viewfinder. So thank you for doing this. You know, I come from more the cultural sphere, and I'm here for a reason, which is that out on the cultural left, it's gotten to be pretty rocky. And it's no surprise to anybody on the call to know that democratic politics has become more activist and leftist, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The word centrism has gotten more of a pejorative associated with it, and the activist, progressive, or radical flank has become more popular. And stepping back from Congress and relatively easy votes like on Iron Dome, and looking at some of the rougher dialectics out there that we have to deal with, which is Zionism becoming a bad word. Looking at how Israel is invoked with colonialism, and it comes trippingly off the tongue, and from people who didn't have an opinion to now having a definite opinion about white supremacy, Jewish supremacy, Zionist supremacy, and Israel becomes a bad actor. Israel is a rogue state. Israel is a pariah in parts of the left where it never used to be thought of, on college campus, in the classroom, in boardrooms of theater companies. You're hearing things you wouldn't have heard a few years ago. So I think it's a mistake only to look at the Iron Dome vote and to say the center is holding, the status quo is okay. It's not. We're in a much more dangerous place in talking about a just and democratic Israel that we love, that I still love, and I still would wear a progressive Zionist mantle proudly. I don't have a lot of company right now in my line of work. And so how we penetrate those areas of influence in all the gradients of the left, and there are many and they are increasing, but I would think it's a mistake to look at the squad as this outlier, and rather to look at the 90, and look at the vote of 9, on Iron Dome is emblematic of, that's an easy vote. And what to do about criminalizing BDS in state governments and look at the numbers that are racking up there, and look at the popularity of nonviolent protest and what worked in fighting apartheid in South Africa. Why can't it work? You're hearing things that will become increasingly challenging to the democratic mainstream on Israel. And that's what concerns me and why I'm here.
Well, Ari, I'm delighted that you're here. Thank you for your comment. We're approaching 2 o'clock, and as you know, our way is to go for an hour and not for longer. Halie, I want to give you an opportunity to close out this part of our discussion, which will go on for weeks and months and years, with any final thoughts you have for us. And I'm gonna do my thank you before, so you're gonna get the last word. Halie, I can honestly say you're one of my heroes. You're one of my champions. And when we spoke of your getting involved with Heart of a Nation and you expressed support for this new venture, I was just so much more confident that we get off to a good start. I love listening to you and seek your counsel and think that you bring such wisdom to this conversation and such an important insight into politics in Washington. So I did my part, and what are your final thoughts for us as we transition to the rest of our day?
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for joining today. I mentioned briefly that Chris Murphy, who is not one of the senators who gets a lot of attention these days. It actually looks like just 2 are getting all the attention. But for those who don't know, he's a senator from Connecticut who recently went to Israel. He's the chair of the Middle East Subcommittee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And when he came back, he's really, and we do need to get him at some point, though getting a member of Congress lately has been very difficult. He came back and he really has been talking quite a bit about the importance of dialogue, not just between the US and Israel, but between the US and Palestinians as a starting point for dialogue again between the Israelis and Palestinians. And he has said, positioning the United States as an honest potential broker puts us in a position to both buttress Israel's security while ensuring the Palestinian people aren't going hungry. And, I would add to that this is quite similar to what we heard from champions of the US-Israel relationship in May, that we, the United States, need to ensure Israel's security, right to self-defense, as well as Palestinian rights and safety. And I am proud to be a part of 2 organizations, both JDCA and Heart of a Nation, that recognize that as well. And I really appreciate the opportunity that presented by Heart of a Nation to have this dialogue between Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians. I think that needs to be the foundation, frankly, of our approach to this conflict if we are ever to resolve it.
Halie, thank you. And Steve, you did a magnificent job. No surprise there. Remember, he's got a weekly newsletter, which is absolutely fabulous. And we'll be promoting that online. I want to thank you all for your comments and for listening. And we've got a few more coming up. Congressman Jamie Raskin is going to be speaking with us shortly. And in the cultural space, Karen Brunwasser of Mikudeshet and Julie, who still is on. Julie is going to be speaking with us in a couple of months. So lots more to come. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.